Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Bear with me. Maybe just raise your hands at the back if you can't quite hear me. Thanks so much for having me here with you this afternoon. I'm really honored to be here to share some of my ideas about teaching grammar. Or some of you might think maybe even not teaching grammar. I don't know, you decide as we go along. So yeah, I'm going to talk to you today about sneaking grammar. Sneaking grammar into the EFL classroom. The Korean classroom is what I have in mind. So by way of an agenda, I want to talk a little bit about some of these terms. Grammar as product, process, and skill, what all this means. I'll come and talk a little bit about explicit instruction and implicit instruction and what that looks like. And then we'll talk a little bit about what I think is probably the most useful or helpful way to teach grammar to younger learners and a lot of learners, probably most learners, I would argue, the most effective way to teach grammar. And then we'll finish off with a little discussion of error correction and feedback within what I'm proposing as a useful way to teach grammar. So I'll just start off with a little quote that kind of caught my eye and I thought I'd share with you all. Education is not the filling of a bucket. Now, as I say this, actually, I want you to think about this in terms of grammar instruction, okay? Think about this in terms of grammar instruction. Education is not the filling of a bucket, but the lighting of a flame. The filling of a bucket. If you can imagine an approach to teaching language, can you imagine an approach to teaching language is like filling a bucket, this bucket, with facts and information about the language? Can you imagine that approach? I think you probably can. I can imagine it. I've experienced it. And you may have too. So what I want to kind of, as I'm talking about the inductive approach to language teaching, I want us to keep in mind that we can never teach students all the English they'll need to be competent learners. We can't give them all the English, all the language, all the structures, all the vocabulary they need. We might be able to help get them to intermediate, but to get beyond there, it becomes very much a self-directed task. So we need to make sure that when it's time for them to make that move, to go off on their own, to get all the language they need to do well, they have the skills, they have the tools to be able to do that. So I'm going to kind of take the mystery out of this whole talk by telling you my main idea right up front. The kind of main claim I'm trying to make here, the main point I'm trying to make. And that's grammar instruction for younger learners, and probably even many older learners, should be implicit and it should be inductive. And it should lead to encourage language acquisition. Now, as we go through, I'm hoping I can kind of unpack, explain what I mean by each of these ideas. First of all, I'll just talk a little bit about what's grammar. What is grammar? And there's probably, there's a lot of different ideas about what grammar is, but there are two in particular that I think are kind of polar views of what grammar is. And one is the idea that a linguist, we can say a linguist knows a lot about English grammar, right? We probably agree with that. But maybe, so let's say, for example, you have a linguist that knows a lot about Korean grammar, but they can't speak Korean. That can happen, right? I've seen it happen, right? So we know that. So that's one side. So they have a pretty good knowledge base in grammar, but they can't speak the language. And that's useful for a linguist. That's very useful for a linguist to have that knowledge. But do we all want to be linguists? Maybe not, right? And then on the other hand, we have a native speaker who knows nothing about grammar, but uses the language just fine. They communicate and they have no issues about that. They're not harmed in any way by not knowing the rules of grammar explicitly. So I'll say, though, that adults may appreciate and benefit from grammar study. Traditional grammar study. Grammar explanation. But younger learners don't. They probably do not, in most cases. They can't focus on the abstract explanation. So if we're explaining and describing grammar to younger learners, they just can't, they don't have the cognitive machinery, the cognitive apparatus. They're not at that stage of development where they can process it, where it can make any sense to them or be useful. But that doesn't mean we can't teach them grammar. We just can't do it that way. So there's kind of three ideas, three notions of what it means to teach grammar, and we already kind of talked about one of them, and that's this idea of grammar as product. Now, I'm wondering if you've experienced this. So it's kind of, there's a lot of explanation involved, there's a lot of focus on the structure, and it tends to be the more traditional methods of instruction, right? So if you think traditionally you might have a lot of translation, translate from Korean to English, or from English, no, actually from English to Korean usually, right? With a lot of explanation. And that's this idea of grammar as product. There's a clear framework, there's structures, it seems like if you open the textbook, there's a sequence, okay, this one comes before this one, and when we finish the textbook, we add them all up, add all these structures up, and that gives us English. Or that gives us beginning English, or intermediate English, right? If we add all those little structures up. But the problem is, well, I'm sure you can predict this. The problem is, even though we have, at the end of the course, we've listened to the explanations, we understand the explanations, it makes sense, we still can't use the language, right? You'll see situations where, and like my example again is the linguist, but the linguist is doing it intentionally. They want to learn about the language, they might not want to learn the language, but on the other hand, if you have someone their goal isn't to learn about the language, their goal is actually to be able to use the language, when they finish, they're going to be disappointed, right? So that's the traditional approach. And then the flip side to this is the idea of an implicit approach. And implicit focuses on using grammar for real communication. So it's using the grammar. And we'll come back and look at how that can be done in a few minutes. It encourages spontaneous expression. So it's all about using. There's less explanation and there's more using the structures. And that's a good thing. But of course, it has its limitations too. One of the main ones is learners may freeze up if they don't know the structure, for example. Or they might wonder, and this is, I think, is especially for older learners, they might wonder why the teacher's not teaching. Do you know what I'm talking about? Yeah. Right? And so this can happen, it's like, wait a second, where's the grammar, where's the explanations about grammar? They're kind of missing the forest through the trees a little bit. So these are some issues with that approach. And so the third idea is then, well, we can look at it as grammar as skill. And this can be useful. And this is something I would advocate. The idea of taking the best of both worlds, taking the best of grammar explanation, very limited grammar explanation, and combining that with more implicit activities. So I'm not saying, I guess the point I'm trying to make here is to say, I'm not saying grammar instruction is never good or it's never useful. It can be useful in moderation, but what I'm saying is in moderation. And, very moderate is the point, especially with young learners. Yeah. Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit about explicit versus implicit instruction. What does explicit instruction look like? It goes back to the product-based approach. It's about the teacher giving the rules up front. This is the rule, this is the grammar rule. Remember it, use it. That's it, right? And so that's pretty much how it goes. It tends to go, as I mentioned, with product-based approaches. And the focus is just giving the rules and then letting students maybe work with examples, ideally work with examples, practice a language. But often in many cases, it can just stop at giving the rules. This is the structure. This is how you use the structure. Next, here's another structure. Here's how you use this structure. Next, here's another structure, right? And so you just have a train of structures and explanations of those structures. So that's explicit instruction. This contrasts with implicit. Implicit is usually tacit, the learner themselves. The learner themselves has to figure out the rule for themselves. So the teacher gives lots of examples. And I'll show you what I'm talking about in a minute. But the teacher gives examples. The learners work with the examples, and they have to figure out the rule. That's implicit instruction. It tends to be with process-based. One other thing I'll mention about the previous, this, if you think, who's at the center of the action with the explicit instruction? Who's the center of that? Who's in charge? The teacher is, right? Because it all comes from the teacher. The teacher has to explain everything. It all goes through the teacher. But on the other hand, if it's process-based, who's in charge here? The students, right? The students are in charge. And if we look at it this way, like as I mentioned, we can get students, it goes back to lighting that flame. We can get students to a certain point. But after that point, after probably intermediate, it really becomes self-learning, their own self-learning that they have to do. Now, imagine this. If you have someone who's telling you, these are the rules, these are the rules, these are the rules, these are the rules, remember them, remember them, versus someone saying, figure out the rule, figure out the rule, figure out what's going on by yourself or with your with other people, with your learning community, who do you think is going to be better prepared when it's time to go off on their own and learn? Right? Does that make sense? So it's the folks who've been doing it, who've been figuring out the rules all along. Been figuring out how the language works all along. When it comes time for them to take more charge of their own learning, they've already been taking charge of their own learning. They're able to go through that process. Now I want to just mention, there's a few, people make a few cases for why we should teach explicit grammar. And like I said, I don't think it's bad all the time. I don't think that you never have to teach grammar rules, but I think you have to do it carefully. You have to do it in moderation. One argument is if you don't teach the rules, learners will fossilize. Do you know what I'm talking about? It's a scary word, right? Fossilize. Wow, that sounds dreadful. And so the thing is, so that's one of the arguments, that if you don't teach the grammar rules, learners will fossilize. They'll get to a certain point and they won't be able to move beyond that point. They'll be stuck using this wrong structure. And it might well be that certain structures, some help with that structure can give the learner the insight they need to go forward. That's why I'm saying it's not, you know, when the learner needs that, when they need it, at that moment when they need that, if you give them the right explanation, I got it, and they can move on. They can move forward. I can give you an example. It's not from grammar, but I think this example applies. It applies to me. I've recently been trying to teach myself the Spanish R. Don't make it, because all the people that make it always, whenever I say that, oh yeah, and they love to make it and show off. But it took a long time for me. I was trying to figure out, okay, how do I do this? And then, so I'm getting advice, I'm getting input from various sources, and then I saw one person said, actually, just think of your tongue like a flag flapping in the wind. And as soon as I heard that, it clicked for me. And then I was able to do it. So I'm not saying at the right time, it can be, these explanations can be helpful. They can give us the insight we need to move us forward. But if it's all explanation, then we can lack some of that insight, right? Some of those insights. So grammar instruction may help learners notice features of the language when they are ready. So if you're explaining a rule and a student is at they're at that point, just where it's like, oh, that's how that makes sense. I got it. Perfect, just what I needed. But the problem is in the whole group of students, you might have 2 or 3 that are there. Everyone else is sort of like, what? The grammar? Well, I don't know. I'm still way back here. Oh, I'm way over here, right? So there's such a discrepancy. That's why the concept of pop-up grammar can be interesting. Have you ever heard of this idea, pop-up grammar? So pop-up grammar it's very much kind of in the moment. It's in the lesson. The learner, the teacher's circulating. They might notice learners are talking, they're communicating, and they hit a block. And then the teacher can come in there and say, oh, this is the structure you need to say, right at the moment when they need it. They feel the communicative need right then for them. And it's just a quick little thing. This is the structure. This is how it works. Move on. We go on. And that's the idea of pop-up grammar. But it's very tailored to their needs. It's explicit. It's deductive. But it meets their needs. So yeah, learning finite rules can help us simplify an otherwise complex task by organizing it. So it can help that way. And then the last point I'll mention here is older learners expect it. And that's what we said a little bit before. Older learners oftentimes expect to get the explicit grammar. And so, I mean, in some ways, you got to kind of meet them maybe halfway. Give them a little bit of what they expect, but give them the other stuff that I would argue, I do argue, they need, not just what they expect. Now, another distinction I think is important here is, I want to talk about arguments for implicit grammar instruction. So why should we do it implicitly? And the main person I'm drawing on for this is Stephen Krashen. He's been talking about these theories for a long time. He's still talking about these theories. He still makes them, and these theories make sense to me. I'm going to try to put a case forward to you all for why it's valuable, why these theories are valuable, and then why they're useful, especially when you're dealing with younger learners. He talks about grammar. He makes this distinction between knowledge and acquisition, or learning and acquisition, I should say. And he says, grammar, when we explicitly explain grammar, it can be helpful, but it really just tells us, it lets us know about the language. We know about English. We don't know English, right? And I mean, but he says that can be helpful. It can be helpful, especially in writing. I don't know if you were in the writing session this morning, but it can be helpful in writing because it can help us, after we write, we can look, oh, okay, I missed that. I know, my conscious knowledge tells me this subject and verb doesn't agree, so I have to make them agree, for example. So it can be helpful knowledge. But he would argue that's not, we can add all the language we want. We can learn all the explanations we want, but it'll never give us the ability to really use the language. We can only get the ability to use the language when we acquire the language. And I'll explain this a bit. So, and his argument is, look, we can use, and it's a pretty straightforward argument, we can use our first language. I do this with Koreans. I'll say, tell me the rule. If someone can, tell me the rule for when I use and when I use le. I've stumped so many Koreans with that. I know it. But I've stumped, and it's because, so we learn the language, even though we don't, implicitly, tacitly, even though we can't explicitly say what the rule is. And it's the same with a native speaker of English, right? So he says, if we want to communicate, communicative competence is our goal, then we have to use the language. We have to use it. Instead of talking about English, we have to talk through English. We have to talk in English. But especially, we have to get input from a variety of sources. So he makes this distinction between acquisition and learning, as I mentioned. He says we have 2 ways of developing the skills and the knowledge in a second language. Acquiring, that's getting the ability to use it for authentic purposes. That's the big one. And we only can use the language if we acquire it. We can only use it if we acquire it. If we learn it, we can't really use it only to help us when we write, to edit, to revise. No, not even to revise, to edit. That's the only time it can really help us. Yeah, and learning the language is the conscious knowledge. Acquisition is the only way we acquire grammar. This is the key point. We acquire grammar only through comprehensible input. That's the only way to get grammar, he says. Grammar that we really can use. The only way is through comprehensible input. And I'll explain what I mean. If it's not clear what that means, I'll explain that in a minute. But that's the only way we can get it, is through comprehensible input. Now, no, wait, no, it's not going the right way. A sec. Okay. So deductive grammar teaching, we mentioned, I already actually talked about this. We go from general rule, specific examples, to practice. Deductive approach is the method that promotes learning, not acquisition. So the deductive approach doesn't promote acquisition. It only, it only promotes learning about English. Not being able to use English for authentic purposes, but only learning about English. So an example of a deductive method is kind of the classic method of teaching grammar. And that's the presentation, practice, production approach. And again, that's where the teacher explains the rule, the students practice the rule, and then the students use the rule. But often what happens is the teacher explains the rule, the teacher explains the next rule, the teacher explains the next rule, and then the teacher explains the next rule, right? So the practice, it can be useful, but in moderation. But the key point that's often overlooked is the practice and the production. Using the rule authentically. And then an example of a deductive method, you've got your grammar explanation here. It's all the explanation. And then you've got the practice piece here. And practice is just doing, fill in the blank is, for example, doing pattern drills, backward build-up drills, slot and fill drills, listen and repeat drills. That's practice. The production part is when the learner tries to communicate using the structure ideally. So maybe doing a role play or a dialogue, or answering discussion questions, something along those lines. So inductive grammar, the more recent of the two. Learners work collaboratively, as we mentioned, to implicitly discover the rule from examples in context. Teachers give guiding questions and prompts, but teachers don't tell them the rule, they figure out the rule for themselves. Students do not have to explicitly state the rules. That's a key point, I think. So there's different versions of implicit teaching, or inductive teaching rather. One version, the student would tell the teacher what the rule is. They would figure out the rule and say, okay, this is the rule, I got it. But it doesn't have to be the case. They can just figure it out and move on. It's the reflection about the rule. Involves learner as reflective people. I think that's a real benefit to inductive approaches to teaching grammar, is that it recognizes the learner as a thinking person, a thinking being who can figure things out for themselves, who can recognize patterns. And that's kind of the important aspect of it, that it really pays attention and takes seriously the learner as being able to figure out the rules. And like I said, when they leave that classroom, they have the skill. If we say, there's the saying, if you give someone a fish, you feed them for a day, right? If you teach someone to fish, you feed them for a lifetime, right? And that's the distinction here, I think. So the deductive approach, explicit instruction, is giving someone the fish. It's immediate, it's right now. Feels good, got it, that's great. But when they go out and they try to interact with text by themselves, they won't have developed the skills of figuring out what the grammar is by themselves. Inductive grammar teaching encourages independence, as we mentioned. It lets them figure things out for themselves. Teachers can help clarify, as the students are doing the exercise, the teacher can circulate, get a sense of what they're struggling with, give them prompts, help them figure out where they've gone wrong. But again, the whole process is the learner themselves trying to come to an understanding of what the grammar pattern is. The other thing is too, I think, especially with inductive approaches, you can expose learners to grammar and have them figure out what it is without having them hate grammar, right? How many people do you know that hate English because their first English classes were grammar heavy? You might be one of them. Yeah, right? Ooh, that hit close to home. But I think that is a valid point, that we have to think, and it goes back again to the idea of lighting that flame. Lighting that flame to say, I want to learn English. English is interesting. English is engaging, right? If I think English is difficult, it's hard, it's boring, it's abstract, okay, well, why do I want to learn this again? Right? Especially if I've got other subjects that are more interesting to me. But if I can find, if we don't have to focus so much on the abstract, if we can play with the language, play with it, I think that can really help learners continue and keep the motivation that they'll need to get to a higher level in English. So this is an example of an inductive grammar activity. I think maybe we'll try this. This is a noticing task. And it's an example of an inductive grammar activity. Let me tell you what to do, and then I'll give you a couple minutes and talk to the person next to you about, and figure this out together if you all can. So what you need to do is look at these two conversations. One of them is in reported. This is reported speech. And this is quoted speech. So what I want you to do is, with your partner, talk about this. What's the difference between, how do we turn this into this? How do we turn the conversation on the left, how do we turn it into reported speech? What's the rule? What are the rules? Okay? Take a couple minutes, talk to the person next to you, and try to figure out what's going on there. Okay, guys, let's chat a little bit about these. There are kind of two things you need to do, right? To turn this into this, there are two things you need to do. Does anyone want to share what one thing is that you need to do? One thing, well, two things you need to get rid of. Get rid of the quotation marks and get rid of the quotation marks, get rid of the comma. And bring the subject to the front, right? Exactly. Bring the subject to the front of the clause. So then it turns into, she suggested. But, you know, we're all pretty bright, but this isn't something I would give kids. But you're not kids. So I wanted you to think through this and go through this process a little bit yourself, right? So this is basically an inductive, this is an example of an inductive activity for teaching grammar. Or we can say noticing. And noticing is actually a really great concept. It's a concept that exists as part of, separate from, and also as part of Krashen's ideas about acquisition. We could say, as we're learning, we're getting input, we can notice features of the language. And as we notice a feature, the argument is, as we notice new features in the input, in the information that we're getting, as we notice them, that leads to intake. That leads us to getting it. And so this kind of pushes us, maybe more than if we just read a lot or if we just had a lot of conversations, this kind of pushes us to notice the features of the grammar, which can ideally help us to get it, to take it in, and then be able to use it ourselves. So that's inductive. Some other inductive instructional activities for learners that you could use songs or poems or rhymes. And as you're working with the songs or the poems or the rhymes or the chants, you could focus on features of the language in the song. Focus on a grammar feature maybe. Not too much, but just highlight the feature. Get the students to notice. So, you know, if it's a story about yesterday, highlight how do we know it's yesterday? Oh, these words have ed on them, right? To pay attention to past tense, for example. Dialogues and readings, we'll talk about that. Role play, using role play that gets us to incorporate a feature that we're paying attention to in the class, or a feature that we're noticing. We can use role play to help us do that. Information gap is another activity that can help us do that. I'll briefly explain what I mean by information gap. Information gap is an activity where I have some information and you have other information and I have to talk to you to get yours and you have to get mine, right? So maybe we have a schedule. We're trying to figure out a schedule. You have half of the schedule, I have the other half of the schedule. And then we talk so that we both understand the whole schedule. And that would be an information gap. And you could do an information gap that focuses on a particular feature of the grammar and get them to pay attention to that. Games like Find Someone Who. This might be for a little bit older learners, but find someone who used to have long hair. And we're talking about to pay attention to the structure used to. Find someone who used to ride a bike. Find someone who used to swim a lot. That kind of thing. So that kind of game can focus again on structure, but not focusing on explaining the structure, but paying attention to the structure, using the structure again and again. Storytelling, writing can help. Pattern practice drills can help. The thing about drills is they're old. Drills are old. They've been around for a long time, right? And the thing about drills, they've been used to death. They have been used to death a lot, right? Overused. And so people think now there's kind of, in a lot of teachers' minds, there's this idea that drills are bad. Oh no, don't use drills, they're terrible. Don't overuse drills, but you can use drills. The beauty, I think, of using drills is that they simplify, they really get down to the structure and just focus on the structure. You're not worried, like, you think of it this way. I always make the analogy, a conversation is like a wrestling match. And when you're in a real conversation, as a language learner especially, you're just trying to survive. You're just trying to just navigate the conversation. There's so much to think about. The beauty of a drill is it takes all that away. It removes all of the focus on meaning and all of the focus on navigating this conversation and just lets the learner work with the language. So there's a place for drill. I think that you could make an argument that there's a good place for drill in language instruction. And again, I would say the best place is when you're focusing on practicing the language. So we do some noticing activities to understand what the rule might be, and then we do some drills to practice that rule, to practice that language, work with that language. And I think it can be valuable. Okay, the other thing I think that's really useful, especially for younger learners, you don't have to analyze grammar to teach it. You can teach language in chunks. Do you know what I'm talking about? You know, if this idea of the lexical approach to language teaching, teaching language as in chunks and focusing on vocabulary. Why is it good to focus on chunks and vocabulary? Because, well, research partly shows us that's actually how we learn a language. We learn the chunk first, we use the chunk a lot, and then we start to think, wait, I'm seeing a pattern here. I can put other words in this chunk. I can take this word out and I can put another word in this chunk, right? And so we can use that. we can figure it out. Like I said, human beings are amazing pattern recognizers. We are experts at it. And if you work enough with it, you work enough with the pattern, you'll figure out what's happening. So chunks like, what time is it? How's the weather? Can you? Do you like? These are useful to teach, and you don't even have to analyze them. You don't have to explain the whys, especially with younger learners. Just teach them. Let them drill it. Let them work with the patterns, and that'll be enough. Let them get the vocabulary. Focus on words that go together. Fish and chips, I'm trying to think, is the only one that comes to my mind. But there are lots. There are words, what patterns of words go together. Teach those words that go together. Yeah, successful communication. Remember too that I think especially early on, too much focus on accuracy, too much focus on being right, being correct, especially early on, it causes people to freeze. It causes them to be afraid to put it out there, to try. I mean, I'm sure you know people, I know people, you have a conversation with them, and you say, hey, how's it going today? And they say, and you literally see them doing the linguistic analysis in their head. They're doing it in their head, right? And then, it's good, so far so good, right? They'll maybe give you some answer like this. But I think that's too much focus. It's the grammar focus. It's the analysis focus. And if I have a chunk of language, here's the bad example, but I think it's bad, but it's good, is, how are you? I'm fine, thank you, and you? But that's the worst example. But those chunks, that automatic language that lets us perform, and it lets us feel better about performing, right? If you can think at the end of the class, if I come out and I can use the language, I can say stuff in the language, that's empowering, right? And these kinds of activities can help us do that. We said songs can use lexical chunks. I don't know if you've ever heard of an earworm. Do you know what an earworm is? Earworm, it's like a song that gets stuck in your head and you can't get it out, right? I say, I walked around for 2 weeks with that EXO song, Jungdok, in my head. It was, help me, save me, someone. It's an earworm, right? It gets stuck in there. And so that's the beauty of music. Music with certain chunks, with certain patterns in the language. They hear it enough times. You know, I've got a song. I'm thinking of a song right now. When I first started teaching in Korea, years ago, a long time ago, I still remember the song. Jack's a mechanic, a very good mechanic. He fixes cars all day at the gas station. Oh gosh, now that's stuck in there. But again, these earworms can help us remember the language, and it helps it stick. Lexical chunks can be fun with comics. You can give the chunks, and you can let them fill in the dialogue with the language chunks. That can be helpful. I didn't put this on here, but I don't know if you guys are aware of a website called Pixton.com. Have you ever heard of Pixton? Check it out, P-I-X-T-O-N, Pixton.com. It's an interesting website. You can make almost kind of publishable quality comics. And you can just make them about anything. And you can move the characters around. You can use different dialogues. It's just like it's like you can make a comic book, basically. I think you can do a 5-panel comic. You have to pay for more, of course, but hey, better than nothing, right? Okay, so yeah, teach language chunks. Another thing that I think really, this is kind of one of the core activities that promotes grammar acquisition in my mind. One of the core activities to promote grammar acquisition is extensive reading. Reading a lot. Reading a lot of comprehensible material. Comprehensible books. Now you might think, comprehensible, how do I get that? That's not always easy to do. I think probably the best place to start is graded readers. Graded readers, I don't know if you know what I mean. I'll maybe briefly explain. This is an example, but they are books written for second language learners, right? And so these books, they start at level 1. And level 1 might have the 300 most common words in English. And they're just recycled again and again and again in the book. Now the thing is, and Paul Nation asked this question, I think it's a great question to ask. He says, look, when you're teaching students to read, because there's a debate, do we want authentic materials that native speakers use, or do we want an authentic experience? Do we want the learner to sit down, to open that book, read the book, and say, this is what it feels like to read in English. It's almost the same as reading in Korean. And so I think that's a valuable question. So you can, through using these kinds of books, you can get the comprehensible input. And I would argue, raise the motivation of the learners because they realize, I can read this, I can understand it, right? With enough vocabulary. I wouldn't say don't give these, of course, to straight up beginners, but once they've got a couple hundred words under their belts, they're ready to go. And they'll pick up words as they continue to read. The best way to acquire foreign language vocabulary is through reading, through extensive reading. That's probably the best way. Incidental learning through extensive reading. It's not the only way, of course, but it's a very effective way. And like I said, especially when you get to the intermediate stage, everybody knows the intermediate plateau. The desert of intermediate. I'm in the desert of intermediate in Korean, so I understand this pain. And you're just going, how do I get out of this? No, really, no. Yeah, but that's the problem. So probably the best way to get out of that desert is extensive reading. You can continue to acquire a vocabulary. And really, at that stage, you're picking up the vocabulary incidentally. You're reinforcing the grammar structures. You're learning the grammar. You are acquiring the grammar through the reading, not paying attention to it. Krashen says you don't even necessarily have to pay attention to it. Our brains figure it out. Through enough exposure over time, we'll figure it out. If you know enough of the words in the text, and that's why graded readers really help, if you know enough of the words in the text. Graded readers, time for reading. This is big, this is important. I mean, okay, you should read a lot. And good luck with it. What? No, that's not going to work. To show the value of reading, to show the value of it, you need to make space for it. This is a valuable thing. How is it valuable? It's so valuable, I'm willing to give up 20 minutes of class time or 15 minutes of class time to do this activity because it's so valuable. Now, of course, I didn't say this. I skipped this one. I shouldn't have. The top one, you need a library of books. There are good, I'm not going to mention any names, but if you just Google graded readers, and there's lots of companies that have extensive collections of graded readers. They've put a lot of thought into it. Narratives, informational texts, high color, beautiful creations. And so the materials are there. We said time, this is another one. This is a big one that people sometimes overlook. Teachers might say, ooh, they're all reading. Now I can do some grading. I can get my own work done. Don't do that. Why not? Because you're the model. They're looking at you. Because we're trying to send the message, this is a valuable activity. This is an important activity, right? And if we say, reading a lot, it's good for you, but it's not really that important for me. I'm fine, thanks. No, that's not really, it's kind of like it's going against the message you want to convey, right? So you've got to engage in it too. And if they see you at the desk reading an English book, engaged in that book, that says more than you could ever explain. And you could tell them all day about the value of reading, but just seeing you reading on a regular basis will say a lot. Here's the other one. that goes with this, don't grade it. There's no assignments attached to this activity. What? Oh, what am I going to do? I think for this to be effective, it has to be a pleasurable activity. They have to enjoy it, right? And so, yeah, it has to be enjoyable. No grades attached, and with this, students choose the book that they read. So you don't say, okay, we're going to make a classroom library, and it's all going to be the same book. Because, you know, we're not all the same people. We're all different people. And, you know, as we all know, kids are people too, and they have their own interests. And their interests are varied. So if you have a wide selection of books, and like I said, with graded readers, there's a wide selection of books to choose from. They can choose a book that interests them. They can read the book, and then they can tell their friends. That's the best advertising ever, right? They read the book, and then they go and tell their friends, oh, this is a good book. Oh, okay, yeah, I'll read this book too, right? So that word-of-mouth advertising gets them engaged, gets them motivated to read even more. And then talk about books. I would say, you know, the one assignment I'd say you could probably do is a book report. And you're like, book report? I remember book reports. Book reports are terrible. I hated book reports. Yeah, it doesn't have to be a written book report. It can be a verbal book report. Does anyone want to tell us about what you're reading today? Someone can stand up and tell the class what they're reading. And again, that's more advertisement for the readings and getting people engaged wanting to read other books and learn more about it. So extensive reading is helpful. Comprehensible input. You know, actually what I think I'd like you to do is take a couple of minutes, have a look at my pictures here, and maybe chat with the person next to you. Can you think of an example? What's an example of each kind of comprehensible input? A way of getting language, listening language, reading language. Have a look at these, chat with the person next to you for a sec, see if you can think of an example for each one of these. Go ahead. 시작합시다, 여러분. There's my intermediate Korean. 자, 계속합시다, 여러분. Let's continue. Okay. So now these are some examples of comprehensible input, and I'll just share some of my thoughts on this before we talk about feedback. So some examples of, I think there's all kinds of ways we can give comprehensible input to our learners. One way, of course, is through video. And you know, YouTube is our friend. There are tons. There are creations on YouTube there's you know, like a phonics song that just blew my mind the other day. I mean, so there's lots of, and the great thing is they're short. So you can Google, like I would say you can, this is probably, I don't know if this is even a verb, I'm going to make it a verb. You can YouTube whatever topic, you can YouTube the seasons, you can YouTube whatever topic you're doing, and you're going to get a wealth of videos, and you can think about how you can use those videos to give more input. And you don't have to, the point is, and Krashen's point is, and for me it's very valuable, just the process of listening, just let them listen. If they're engaged, if they listen a couple of times, they get the idea, it's comprehensible to them, that's enough. That's going to give them more language input. You know, the argument I've heard, the most interesting argument I've heard for why we need to do deductive explicit instruction, the argument is, well, in this context, it's an EFL context. So they can't get enough input, so we have to explain everything. That doesn't work for me. We live in a society, we live in an age where we can get access to information anytime. We can go online, we can get access to these kinds of graded readers. So now, any former reasons that we had for not using more input in the class, more exposure to language, it's songs that they picked up at the Yuchiwan, and they wanted to go home and listen to those songs at home, right? And again, that's giving them that input again and again. We could say I would say peer writing. This is kind of the flip side of this. Peer writing is like, I don't know, for the folks who were in the writing workshop this morning, he talked about publishing the writing work. Honestly, I think publishing is the biggest piece of the puzzle. That's the buy-in. In the real world, when we write for an audience. The only time we ever write for no apparent reason at all is at school, right? But so publishing your work and share, and when I say publishing, I don't mean going to a publisher. I'm talking about sharing it with your friends, putting it on a bulletin board, right? Putting it on a blog. All of these are options. When we do this, we publish our work, we share our work with our colleagues. That's comprehensible input. Why? They're at my level. What we know about language learning now is you don't have to worry that they're going to pick up each other's errors. That's not going to happen. It doesn't work that way. They can share their work with each other, especially edited work, revised work, and it gives them an authentic audience. They're thinking, I'm writing this for a real reason, you know, like we do in the real world, right? So that's valuable. We said extensive reading. We already said that one. Teacher input. Your voice, it doesn't mean talk, you know, there's a balance, but your input is valuable, is important to them, especially I'm speaking to the Korean bilinguals in the audience right now, especially the folks, especially in your case, because you learned English the hard way. You are the model of an English. They'll never look at me and say, someday I'm going to be like Dennis. That's never going to happen. Because I didn't learn English the same way they did. You did. And they look at you and they say, that's okay, I'm going to be like my teacher. And so you can model that for them, right? And in the process, give them the comprehensible input they need. Here, again, this is the flip side of this one, where we're just conversations, giving students a chance to talk to each other in the class. Use the structures and the vocabulary that they're learning. It might be messy. It might not be pretty. That's okay. They're playing with the language. We know that these things, we don't have to worry that they're making bad habits. We don't have to worry about that. We'll let them play with the language. They can see that it's fun. It's interesting. I can share information with my friends. And that gives them, in that process, they get comprehensible input. The last one, I'll just look by, maybe throw it out there and see if you know what I'm talking about. TPR. Have you ever heard of TPR? Some folks have. Okay, a lot of you seem to have. It's valuable. It's a valuable activity. It's a good way to get the learners moving around, especially young learners, get them moving around. It's a bit limited in the sense that traditionally it's based on commands. You know, do this, go there, do that. And so following commands is kind of tricky. But there's a new variation of TPR now called TPRS. I think it's TPR story time or storytelling, I believe it is. And so that kind of gets away from some of the traditional limitations of TPR. So TPRS, you might want to check that out. But again, there's lots of sources of comprehensible input that will let learners acquire the language, get used to the patterns, enjoy the language, enjoy the process. For me, the most important thing, the thing that tells me they're going to get to being a competent language learner, the thing that tells me that is, the greatest predictor in my mind is how invested are they in the language? How much do they care about the language? How enjoyable is the language? How motivated are they? That's what's going to get them. Because like I said, we can get them to intermediate, maybe, but beyond that, it's up to them, right? Get them to the desert of intermediate. Scary thought. All right. Okay, so I'll just finish up by talking a little bit about mistakes and errors, how we can deal with error correction. And I'll make a distinction between a mistake and an error. A mistake is a slip. A student can make a mistake, they can make a slip, but it's not, I make mistakes. I've probably made 20 or 30 in this talk alone, right? But it's not an error. An error is a problem, they don't know the difference. They don't realize that they're making the mistake. That's the big difference. When it's a mistake, you realize and you catch yourself and you change it, right? But when you make an error, you don't realize that it's a problem. So you focus on errors, you don't worry about mistakes. Don't worry about mistakes at all. And so what does that mean? It means an error is a pattern. You're looking for patterns in their language. If you see a pattern of the same mistakes again and again, that's when you should pay attention to it. But if it's a mistake, you don't have to worry about it because we all make mistakes, right? Okay, so error correction. I would say focus on feedback that includes implicit inductive learning. Don't deal with all oral production. I'm focusing mostly on oral production here. I think I'm focusing mostly on oral production. But we don't treat all speaking, whenever we hear, we don't have to correct everything we hear. There's good times to correct and bad times to correct, right? And the best time, it depends on the stage. These are the things that really matter. It depends on the stage of the activity, where they are in the language activity. Depends on what the focus of the activity is, and I'll explain this in a second. It depends on what kind of mistake they're making. And it depends on the student's personality. And that's a big one. That's one we often forget about. We often forget that some students like it. They enjoy it. Other students are terrified and they will shut down if you correct them, if you overcorrect them. So what I mean by the stage of the activity is kind of the same as this. Accuracy, if we are doing a drill, if we're practicing the language, if we're focusing on the structure a bit, that's the time to note errors. So if you notice students making an error and you're practicing a structure, that's the time to point it out to a student. To say, actually, you say it this way rather than that way. So if you're focusing on accuracy, if you're focusing on practicing the language, if you're focusing on speaking communication, just speaking to somebody, just we're having a conversation, don't focus on errors. I don't know about you, but have you ever had this experience? I have. Someone decides, I meet someone, I don't know them very well, but I meet them, and they decide they're going to make themselves my Korean teacher. Thanks. Just in this conversation. And now they're going to tell me all the mistakes that I made. Let me tell you what, in like 2 minutes, I don't want to ever talk to them again. Right? And the point is that there's a time for error correction, and when you're really trying to communicate a message, that's not the time. Right? So yeah, it depends on the type of mistakes. And I say in this case, the type of mistakes is patterns. If you notice patterns in mistakes, I'll come back to this. We talked about this already. Accuracy versus fluency. And when I wanted to give you a couple of examples here. So if we're focusing on accuracy, I mentioned drills. If we do dialogues, controlled dialogues, some kind of information gap, these activities, this is when we can correct errors. When we notice them making mistakes, because the focus is on the language, right? And then we can jump in and say, okay, let's make a correction here. If we're doing role plays, if we're doing speaking to a group, if we're doing warm-ups, I'd say don't focus on error correction at that point, because they're trying to communicate. They're trying to communicate a message and have fun with the language. So error correction, what type of error correction? How can we do it? I tried to think of gentle ways to do error correction. That's what I'm trying to keep in mind here. A recast is a very gentle way to do error correction. So if I say, what did you do yesterday? I go to my friend's house. What did you do yesterday? I go to my friend's house. The recast is, oh, you went to your friend's house. So it's kind of an unobtrusive way of saying, correcting the error, but not really explicitly correcting the error. Now the problem with recasts, though, there's been some research on this. The problem with recasts, it might work for the particular student. It might work with some of these other ideas here. But the problem with the recast is sometimes students don't get it. They're just like, yeah. So it's like, what did you do yesterday? I go to my friend's house. Oh, you went to your friend's house. Yes, I go to my friend's house. Okay. In that case, you might have to be a bit more explicit about it. But there are varying degrees. You could ask a question. Oh, you go to your friend's house? And that'll kind of hone in a bit more. Facial expressions and gestures can be helpful. A raised eyebrow, a scratch of the head. This can give us a clue, right, in an unobtrusive way that doesn't, and again, that goes back to personality. Some students appreciate for you to say, actually, you meant to say, I went yesterday. And they're fine with, oh yeah, thanks, I appreciate the feedback, right? Yeah, hints could be another one. Just give them a hint. So we said here, my friend come yesterday. She said my friend came, not come, but. So that's an example of a hint. I'm telling them the word, right? It's a prompt. Not come, but, oh, my friend came yesterday. And the other thing, another really kind of gentle error correction is just keep track of the errors that you notice students making. With younger learners, there's two ways to handle it. With younger learners, pay attention to the errors that you notice them making, make note of them, and guess what? That's your material for future lessons. You build that into future lessons, right? So if you notice common patterns of error, you can notice who's making those errors, and then have a little lesson with them. Pull them aside and have a little lesson with them about that. That wouldn't hurt. A pop-up grammar lesson. With older learners, you can keep track of the errors and then put them on the board. Let the students work in groups to find out what the error is. Let them work with it, and let them inductively figure out what the error is. Yeah. And then, okay, so those are some ideas for error correction. I'm just going to finish off by where I started and say my main point one more time. Grammar instruction for young learners should be implicit, it should be inductive, and it should focus on language acquisition, not language learning. So with that, I guess I'll say thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.